We are reaching the end of Revelation here, and there is, in this book, has baffled many interpreters because the book is written in symbolic language, and we would like to to know exactly what each symbol represents. And you might recall that when we started our study, we said that there is one approach that focuses on decoding the symbols, and then there is the approach of seeing the symbolic world of Revelation actualized. So the tendency for many, especially in conservative circles, has been to focus on decoding. What exactly does this symbol represent? And here is someone who is thinking, I found this, I actually was looking up, I looked up an old lecture that an anesthesiologist at the hospital where I worked in Norway. He was a very clever anesthesiologist, and he had a good grasp of palliative care, and I needed to review some things when we were taking care of my mother-in-law at home, some medical issues. So I reviewed one of the lectures he had given, and he was quite entertaining, and I found he had this slide as one of his slides, and this is sort of the decoding. There is, you see this person who is going around making sure that everybody knows what is what, and I hope my efforts here have been rewarding, that we have decoded the book of Revelation and you know exactly what each symbol now means. Well, you know that the book isn't like that, so maybe that was the wrong approach to the book. So if you wish to comment on it, please do. Now, I also think, and this is also another slide I found in his presentation on how to relieve people's pain in terminal care. There are some impediments to seeing. What is the impediment here? I am not intending this for its political message. If that is what you think, I am very mean, but that is not my intention here. I'm just saying that there are some impediments to seeing. There are certain ways we are conditioned in certain ways, and I want to share with you something I just read. I actually heard someone talk about this on NPR, and then I went and downloaded Mark Twain's book, Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And here is one. We have touched on this before, but let's just say that this is under the headline "Impediments to Seeing," sort of getting all mixed up because there are certain things you're conditioned a certain way. I'm accessing the story, and I wish somebody else who could read it with the right accent and twang, could do this. But let me try here. This is. They are on a Mississippi riverboat. In both of these books, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, they are both on the Mississippi riverboat, right? I mean, you're Americana here. You should. Is that okay? And then Huck Finn, he is in the company of a liberated slave who has eloped, someone who has run away, a runaway slave. And he has some compunctions about his participation in helping this person run away. And he is discussing this with himself in what I will be reading. And this I'm starting here then. I think this is in chapter 7 in the book. Once I said to myself, it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, as long as he'd got to be a slave, since that was the only option. So if that's what he had to be, then it would be better for him to be there. And so I'd better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him to tell Miss Watson where he was. But I soon gave up that notion for two things. She'd be mad and disgusted at his rascality and ungratefulness for leaving her, and so she'd sell him straight down the river again. And if she didn't, everybody naturally despises an ungrateful nigger, and they'd make Jim feel it all the time, and so he'd feel ornery and disgraced. And then think of me. it would get all around that Huck Finn helped the nigger to get his freedom. And if I was ever to see anyone from that town again, I'd be ready to get down and lick his boots for shame. That's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, and then he don't want to take no consequences of it. Thinks as long as he can hide, it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. The more I studied about this, the more my conscience went to grinding me. The more wicked and low down and ornery I got to feeling. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden that there was the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven, whilst I was stealing a poor old woman's nigger that hadn't even done me no harm, and now was showing me there's one that's always on the lookout, and ain't a going to allow no such miserable doings to go only just so far and no further. I most dropped in my tracks, and I was so scared. So he has pangs of conscience for helping this person escape, for sort of doing this mean trick to this poor old woman who had owned a slave. That's his predicament. Well, I tried the best I could to kinder soften it up somehow for myself by saying I was brung up wicked, sinful nature, and so I weren't much to blame. But something inside me kept saying, there was the Sunday school. You could have gone to it, and if you'd have done it, they'd learnt you there that people that acts as I've been acting about that nigger goes to everlasting fire. It made me shiver. And I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down. But the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try to and hide from him. Not from me, neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come, the words. It was because my heart weren't right. It was because I weren't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin. But away inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing, and go and write to that nigger's owner and tell where he was. But deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie, and he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. So I was full of trouble, full as I could be, and didn't know what to do. At last I had an idea, and I says, I'll go and write the letter, and then see if I can pray. Why, it was astonishing, the way I felt as light as a feather right straight off, and all my troubles all gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and sat down and wrote, Miss Watson, your runaway nigger Jim is right down here 2 mile 2 mile below Pikesville. And Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send. I felt good, and all washed clean of sin, for the first time I had ever felt so in my life. And I knowed I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. And I went on thinking, and I got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the night time, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him. Only the other thing. I'd seen him standing my watch on top of his own. They took watch, at night, and he did double duty. That's what he's saying. Instead of calling me, so I could go on sleeping. And I see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog. And when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was, and such like times, and would always call me honey, and pet me and do everything he could think of for me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard. And he was so grateful. He saved him by lying about, smallpox. And he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling, because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said. And I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, and being brung up to it, and the other weren't. And for starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again. And if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. So what's the point? There are some impediments to seeing. Just like we talked in the Nietzsche story. There is some person here who has done something wrong. He has helped someone get his freedom from slavery. And he thinks that for that sin he will go to hell, because that's what they are teaching. And so he has to make a decision about what he intuitively thinks is right, and what he has been taught is right, and the consequences of that. And I will say again and again, when we do theology, we face huge impediments to seeing because we have been conditioned a certain way. I'm saying that impediments to seeing affect all of us to varying degrees. That is, and this is quite an amazing story. I think it is off the same page as the discussion we had about Nietzsche a few weeks ago. Now, Brad sent me some statements. I excerpted a few of the texts that you sent me, because we ended up 2 weeks ago talking about the healing of the nations and the perspective on the healing of the nations. And then there is a whole array of texts in the Old Testament where there is, where the healing of the nations is attempted but not accomplished. It just comes to grief, the project of healing the nations. And you see it affects Israel, it affects Israel's enemies. And there is all this language of healing, all these efforts at healing. And then the report that it wasn't successful. So keeping that in perspective too makes the text in Revelation 22 that there is healing for the nations ultimately. That puts it, drives home the point even more poignantly, I think we can see. So please review these texts and others like it, because there is this is quite a striking emphasis in the Old Testament. Let me just comment then on those texts before we move on into what we will call the epilogue in Revelation. That talking about God, talking about theology in a healing framework, we could say it like this, that the language of healing is not inferior. It is not second-class terminology for talking about God and what God is up to in the world. Now, it is not the language that dominates theological discourse. Theological discourse has adopted another framework that has been the sort of go-to place. And if you want to prove your valor as a theologian, you need to have mastery of that other terminology. But as we have seen here, and as we see in the book of Revelation, the terminology of healing, the language of healing, is prioritized. It is the preferred terminology in some ways. Okay, So let's just say that this language is not an inferior language. Specifically, giving preference to the language of healing might be the remedy for the most negative consequences of theology that is one-sidedly welded to legal terminology. And I'm thinking especially on the sort of gung-ho-ness that there has been in that framework for punitive action and just visions of punitive actions that defeats any notion of healing. That just seems to me be that there is some competition there between these two frameworks, and those who are attracted to a framework of healing should not feel that is outside the realm of the Bible. The Bible is quite fond of that language, and is in the book of Revelation, as we see, that is sort of the end point. The end of the story is a vision of healing. So, yes, Revelation revels in the language of healing. Well, enough said about that. Let's do the epilogue. And if one of you would read Revelation 22:6, and then we will move through the rest of the chapter.
And he said to me, These words are trustworthy and true, for the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place.
And I think we can read verse 7 at the same time.
See, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book.
So what you see here, there is an emphasis on the one hand, there is the foundation, that is the God's trustworthiness, which we have seen again and again emphasized. We have called it the faithfulness of God, or the trustworthiness of God. That's kind of that's what has been at stake. And then this messenger or our companion who gives this guided tour in the end says these words are trustworthy and true. And then there is a response to that, and what is the response? Well, the response is to keep the words, to trust it, to rely on it, and to make that part of one's faith journey. So, which is more important, trustworthiness or trust? Well, they are. It would be unfair to prioritize them, but trust relies on trustworthiness that has been demonstrated, that there has been a demonstration. It is not that trust hangs on nothing. It hangs on something that has been demonstrated, and that is what our story and what the New Testament or the Bible has been up to all along, to demonstrate God's trustworthiness. Isn't that? I think we can say that. So here is a text on ministry of angels, verses 8 and 9. If someone else would read that.
I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me. But he said to me, You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your comrades, the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God.
Yeah. Well, why do we need this kind of clarifier here? That seems a little unnecessary, doesn't it? Seems a little strange. I'm hard at work these days. I have assembled quite a body of literature because we have said before here that the view of reality that you find in the book of Revelation is that there is a divine reality, there is a human reality, and there is a non-human reality. Angels, good and bad. Angels unfallen and fallen angels. A non-human reality. And many things, the storyline in the book of Revelation is in some ways conditioned, is in some ways, in some huge way, influenced by the role of what happened in the non-human reality. We have wrestled with that. Now, again, we have a problem because in the history of the theological tradition doesn't have much to say. The theological tradition kind of kind of deleted that non-human reality. It has no prestige. It has no explanatory power. So the theological tradition has centered on the divine and the human reality and tried to explain everything within that framework. And here we have a sort of just a reminder. It isn't all revisiting that topic, but you know, here there are angels in the story, and it's, you know, an angel that seems to play a role that makes this person think, yeah, well, you know, it's almost like God, you know, that the non-human reality is at the very least a very significant reality. And some of the theologians who have been most disdainful of this reality is a person like Karl Barth, who I've said before here, may be the most influential theologian of the 20th century, who is so dismissive, is so full of contempt for the non-human reality. So I'm trying to write a chapter for a project I'm working on where I'm going to try to rebuild sort of the ontologic significance, the significance of another order of being to understand reality, and that's the non-human reality. So anyway, just reminded of that when we see this text and an angel that makes him think he should, you know, that John should worship that person, and he says, well, don't do that, because worship is, you know, in the Bible, worship operates along that line, the big sort of what we have called the ontologic dividing line, you know, between who is above that line? God. And then everything else is below it, you know. And worship is the one thing, who is to be worshipped? God only, you know. So wherever if there is, you know, worship of someone other than God, it is not, that's, the Bible is sort of trying to clarify that for us. So anyway, I think that's enough said about that. Let's read on verses 10 and 11.
And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Let the evildoer still do evil, and the filthy still be filthy, and the righteous still be right, and the holy still be holy.
There is an echo of the book of Daniel in this text. What's the echo? It's actually a contrast to the book of Daniel. Let's do that one first. What is the contrast to the book of Daniel? The book of Daniel ends by saying, seal up the book, because the time is far. It refers to a distant future. And here John, which in some ways is a companion to Daniel, is saying, or is being told, do not seal up the words, because the time is near. So you have a sense of forward movement in time, don't you? You know, to the that in Daniel the decisive events in history are still distant, but not so in the book of Revelation. And then there is this notion that there is a point in time where there is no more, where you pass a point of no return. Let that person who made up their mind to go that route, let that be the case. And then, so you have a sort of dividing of ways here, point in time. I think various church traditions, in the Adventist tradition, there is this notion of the closing of the door of mercy, which is, I'm not sure you want to discuss that idea, if you want to affirm it or if you want to elaborate on it. Is there a closing of the door of mercy? Is that a good way of saying it? The door of opportunity, the closing of a window of opportunity, is that better? Because the closing of a door of mercy would seem like it is something, you know, it could give the sense that this is something God does arbitrarily. Well, it's time to close the door, you know. So the notion then of missing an opportunity could, yes. Well, that's a good analogy. We have an Old Testament text, the Noah, the story of the ark, and the door closes when? At what point does the door close? when there are no more passengers, when no one else is coming. So it isn't arbitrary. If that is the case, if we can use that as our analogy, then it isn't just, well, it's too bad, you didn't come on time. It was not a point in time. It was when there was a reality beyond which it was not meaningful to keep the door open, you might say. There is something that has consolidated in human reality, and that cannot be overruled. There is no overruling of what has consolidated and settled in human reality. So, okay, let's go on here. Here are a couple of texts about Jesus and the divine identity. Again, these are in many ways summary statements. Remember, we're now in the epilogue of the book, so you're just taking up certain things that have been themes earlier in the text. So who will read 12 and 13?
See, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, to repay according to everyone's work. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end.
So who is talking here? It's Jesus who is talking. He is the one who is coming soon. And he calls himself what? The Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Now, if we use Old Testament, use our method here, which says, go to the Old Testament, see if there is an Old Testament background for this, and there surely is. Here is a whole array of texts in the book of Isaiah. Thus says in 44:6, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and there is no God besides me. Who is talking? Well, God. God is talking. Isaiah 41:4, who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am he. And 48:12, listen to me, O Jacob, even Israel, whom I called. I am he, I am the first, I am also the last. So what do we see here then when Jesus calls himself, I am the first, I am the last? That Jesus is placing himself within the divine identity. But the Christology of the New Testament, the Christology of the book of Revelation, is in some ways a narrated Christology. It is not Christology the way it was argued in the early church, where the early church, from the days of Constantine and Nicaea and all those meetings that they held, very controversial meetings, where they argued the nature of Christ philosophically, in a sort of substance Christology, that there was the same substance. It is not substance Christology, it is divine identity Christology. And Richard Bauckham, who visited our campus a few months ago, he has done wonderful work on divine identity Christology and showing how that construct is developed in the Bible. That Jesus is narrated to the early church, to the early Christians, as the person who belongs to divine identity. He can say with no qualifications, I am the first and I am the last, appropriating terminology that is exclusively belonging to God in the Old Testament. See? So there is a fascinating discussion in a book. Let me try to tell it in a very short way. There was a discussion in Baghdad in the year 800 or so between the highest official of the Christian church and the Muslim ruler of Baghdad at that time. It is a very amicable discussion, a discussion among people who seem to talk to each other as though they are equals. The Muslim talks very respectfully to the Christian, and the Christian speaks very respectfully to the Muslim, and they are discussing who has the truth, who is really right on this, knowing as they do that Christology, the role of Jesus is an contested area between Islam and Christianity. And the Christian patriarch, his name is Timothy, he is a very educated man, and the Christians served at high levels of government for the for the Muslims that might to some extent have been less educated. That is in some ways implicit. And then what is fascinating is, for one thing, what is fascinating is the tone of mutual respect, the tone of genuine dialogue. What is more fascinating is that when the Christian, Timothy, tries to explain Christian Christology to the Muslim using philosophical categories, it is a discussion he's bound to lose. It is, I can see, trying to put myself in the Sultan's shoes, I can see why he cannot make head or tails out of that account. You know, the Christian, the way Christianity has tried to explain its Christology and the role of Christ in philosophical terms. My sympathies, my heart goes out to the Sultan for not being, you know, entirely persuaded by the way, you know, the theological tradition has done it. But Jesus in the Bible is configured as belonging to the divine identity. No philosophical, without trying to sort of explain that in philosophical terms, you get the idea. This is a somewhat complicated subject. Let's run away from it. Okay, 14 and 15, and then a little bit a side glance to something contemporary. Who will read verse 14?
Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates.
I think we can say that the book of Revelation is not afraid to hold out incentives to its readers. It is not afraid to say that there is something at the end of the journey that is worth having. And here I think you can see a bit of a tone of the voice of John, or the Gospel of John, that they may enter the city by what? By the gates. Which chapter in the Gospel of John would you think about here? Chapter 10. Where Jesus is the gate to the sheep. And those who want to enter, they enter by the gate. And there are others who try to enter by climbing over the wall, you know, and they are the thieves and the robbers. There is a Johannine texture to this verse here. So I hear the whisper of the Gospel of John, or the same person there, to have the right to the tree of life and enter the city by the gate, by the gates. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Again, in a way that is quite typical of classical rhetoric, even classical rhetoric in antiquity, where you hold out incentives and you hold out disincentives. You know, why you should choose this. You know, obviously it looks, and the rhetoric is quite you know, one side it is pure and attractive and enticing, and the other side the rhetoric is very, very, very negative, the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators. And then maybe the bottom line is the most significant, everyone who loves and practices falsehood, which doesn't just mean telling things that aren't so in just everyday relationships, but it is telling falsehoods about God. That is part of the basic story, and to misrepresent God, that's the hallmark of the other side. So you see that incentive and disincentive. Well, here is the Time magazine that Gerald was mentioning, and now you can comment on it. And there is a pastor in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who I had not heard of till just very recently. His name is Rob Bell. He has quite a following. He's quite a prominent preacher in the evangelical community. He has a large church there in Grand Rapids, and he has written a book called Love Wins. And Kyle and we talked about this a few weeks ago, and suddenly this book leaps to the front of to the cover page of Time magazine. The book has been heard as though he is questioning the reality of hell, which has been seen to be controversial in the faith community where this pastor is working. And The book has also been heard as though he is holding out the possibility of salvation for everyone. And the sort of pivot point in his own story is an exhibit that they had, that he was arranging an exhibit on peacemaking. And he had Gandhi as one of the peacemakers there. And then one of the people who attended the conference said that you have to do a reality check on Gandhi as a role model, because Gandhi is going to burn in hell. And our pastor, Rob Bell, thought, well, that is really something. You know, it's Gandhi going to burn in hell. And so he is weaving a narrative to some extent, is he, from that? Or I have just read the second-hand literature here, as it were. Well, it puzzles me, and it sobers me too. You know, why is it? Because now there is one thing that has been characteristic in the Adventist emphasis has been to take the eternal punishment out of the equation. I just wonder if the way we have done it, like we've said before, we did it on quantitative terms. We said there isn't eternal punishment, but there is hell, there is retribution, there is a sort of a timed, you know, a limited punishment. Whether that was good enough to go out to the world with that, whether that is a sufficient modification of the traditional paradigm, maybe the next step would be to say that there is a qualitative difference, not just a quantitative difference, the length of punishment, that the whole way the things end is somewhat different, and we have not done that in a way that is consistent ourselves. I will just add my comments here. Whether there is a hell is indeed a question about the love of God. You know, what is God's character? You know, yes, there are arguments on other sides of that question, as we all know, but I'm just wishing to make a distinction between two elements in this story. The notion that whether there is a hell is one thing, whether there is a universal salvation is not necessarily a question about the love of God, because there is another question here, and that is the question of freedom. And I think when I look at theologies that even Origen, I want to do a session on Origen here in the cosmic conflict story in the early church to see how the early church thought about the cosmic conflict. But even Origen tends toward universal salvation, even though he seems to understand freedom quite well, but not well enough. Because the notion of freedom is, if universal salvation is only a question about the love of God and not also a question about freedom, then it would be easy. But it seems to me that the question is also about freedom. When I went to Andrews University to give my presentation on the cosmic conflict a few months ago, several people in the audience thought that I was articulating a theological tradition that is all about the love of God, which is a big misunderstanding. It isn't all about the love of God. It is, to a very significant degree, a discussion about freedom, about creaturely freedom, even to the point that some people might choose not to be saved, not to come on board. So anyway, let's go on here. I will rush through the rest of it. It is I, Jesus, who sent my angel to you with this testimony for the churches. I am the root and descendant of David, the bright morning star. What do you hear here? You hear an allusion to Isaiah 11:1-10, the root and descendant of David. Probably the most significant prophetic text in the Old Testament. Certainly a text hugely influential on the message of Revelation, here in the ending of Revelation, and also in Revelation 5, where the lamb that has been slaughtered is from the root and descendant of David. Here, Davidic kingship is given a cosmic scope. And then Jesus calls himself the morning star. But who is the morning star in the Old Testament? So Jesus is there is a cosmic conflict texture to that claim. I am the morning star, not the other one who has sort of outplayed that role. And Jesus has in some ways, is assuming that role of the angelic figure. I am the morning star. You see that contrast there? It's quite fascinating, but I'm going to not get to do this text here. I preached some meetings in Oslo in Norway some years ago, and I had a topic that I called the message of the Bible in one word. And I asked the audience to say what that word would be. Now you tell me, here in this highly educated community with biblically literate people, if you were to boil down the message of the Bible to one word, what would that word be? Reconciliation. That's a noun. I'm just categorizing it. Reconciliation. It works. It's close. Others. It might be right. What else? Come. That's a verb. The Bible likes verbs. Bible likes, but anyway, any other comments? Well, you can see that I'm trying to set you up here. The Spirit and the bride say, come. Then let everyone who hears say, come. And let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes take the water of life as a gift. I was proposing to the audience in Oslo that if you were to choose just one word to get the sort of, if you just had to go with one word, it would be the word. It would be the word come. It would be a verb. It would be an invitation here, and there are Old Testament antecedents for this in Isaiah 55:1, where the text is accessing deeper human needs. Isaiah 41:17, similar text, and then this is a theme in Revelation where human need is configured as thirst, and thirst is what kind of need? Thirst is a vegetative need. Thirst is a visceral need. That kind of thing. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of water of life in Revelation 21:6. In the Samaritan woman in John 4:10, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, let anyone who is thirsty come to me. So what are we seeing here? Let me try to give my take on it. Number one, Revelation is a book of profound theology, but the first order of business is to urge the reader to come, even if our theological world is topsy-turvy. In the book Steps to Christ, Ellen G. White says that some people wonder whether they must repent before they can come to Jesus. It would seem the logical thing to do. You repent, then you come to Jesus. Ellen White says what? You come to Jesus, and he will take care of the rest. You do not do anything before you come to Jesus. You come to Jesus first. With our theological worlds all messed up, whatever it is, there is still we can come to Jesus on a very primitive foundation. Revelation addresses human need on a visceral level, not only on a cognitive and intellectual level. Revelation ends in a vision of vocation, and let everyone who hears say, come. So we're not just invited to sit in the audience, or not just invited to come, but we are invited to do what? To say come, to make the influence, spread beyond our horizon. So we are not just in this as spectators, you might say. Revelation promises access to the water of life now, in this life. Let everyone who thirsts drink now from the water of life. So those are some of the things. I think our time is up, so we will do the last few verses here, and I have given you I'm hoping that you will see it as an assignment to choose the ending of Revelation that you think ought to be prioritized. The ending and the endings of the book of Revelation. And we'll do that next time. Thank you.